Equality Day Suffrage Roundtable virtual event.
Watch this with me.
Let me introduce the Arizona Historical Society staff who are working this event tonight. I'm David Turpey. If there are people with their mics on, could you please mute them? Thank you. I'm David Turpey. I'm the Vice President of Exhibitions, Education, and Publications at the Arizona Historical Society and editor of the Journal of Arizona History. Our moderators tonight are Janie Adams, who is the education team lead and museum educator at the Arizona History Museum in Tucson, and Laura Key, who is the lead curator and associate editor of the Journal of Arizona History. And we'll also be joined later by Shelley Coriel, who is the outreach coordinator for the Arizona Historical Society. Our mission at the Arizona Historical Society is connecting people through the power of Arizona's history. The Arizona Historical Society was established by an act of the First Territorial Legislature on November 7th, 1864. AHS is Arizona's oldest historical agency. We have museums around the state in 4 different cities. We have the Pioneer Museum in Flagstaff, the Arizona Heritage Center in Tempe, the Arizona History Museum in Tucson, Sanguinetti House Museum and Gardens in Yuma, Reardon Mansion State Historic Park in Flagstaff, Downtown History Museum in Tucson, and Historic Fort Lowell Museum in Tucson. Just like to point out for those of you who live here in Arizona that we also have a new specialty license plate that is now available with our monsoon image here, which is very appropriate this time of year. So we encourage those of you who are renewing your plates to consider supporting the Arizona Historical Society by getting one of our license plates. Just a brief announcement about upcoming virtual events. We have several coming up in September. One on September 2nd from one of our curators, Jill Huff, on the 5 F's of Flagstaff. Then there's the Colorado River Days, Flagstaff. There's a couple of virtual events connected with that. And then on September 17th, we'll have another virtual panel discussion like this one with 5 or 6 panelists speaking about monuments and memorials in Arizona. We also encourage all of you to join the Arizona Historical Society. When you become a member, you are supporting the preservation of history through our collections, exhibits, educational programs, and more. There are many benefits to joining. You get unlimited free admission at all of our museums. You get a 10% discount at all AHS museum gift shops, and also receive a subscription to the award-winning Journal of Arizona History, which is our quarterly publication dedicated to all aspects of Arizona history. And here is a couple images of recent covers from the Journal of Arizona History. As I said, it's our quarterly publication. Members receive print copies in the mail and also access to digital copies as well. If you're interested in more information, you can visit our website at azhs.org for the latest news and events. And now, thank you for listening to all of that. Now to tonight's program. So tonight's discussion builds off of essays that we published in our most recent edition of the Journal of Arizona History. In that issue, we asked 5 scholars who have studied the women's suffrage movement in other places to think about the women's suffrage movement in Arizona in comparison to the places that they have studied. In order to facilitate the discussion that took place in the journal, we asked the scholars to read Heidi Osselaer's Winning Their Place, Arizona Women in Politics, 1883 to 1950, which was published by the University of Arizona Press in 2009. So we asked the scholars to read Dr. Osselaer's book and then make comparisons with the regions, states that they have studied. So with that background, let me hand it over to Janie Adams, who is the lead moderator tonight.
Good evening, everyone. We're so happy to have you here with us. I'm just going to introduce our panelists really quick, and then we'll get started. So one of our first panelists is Heidi Osselaer, who is the author of Winning Their Place, Arizona Women in Politics, 1883 to 1950. Then we have Kif Augustine-Adams of Brigham Young University, Sara Egge of Center College, Shannon Risk of Niagara University, Rachel Gunter of Collin College, and Karen Pastorello of Tompkins Cortland Community College most recently. So to start tonight's program, I'm actually going to ask a question specifically of Heidi. Can you tell us, give us a brief synopsis of your book to kind of kick our conversation off?
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I really appreciate that we're celebrating Women's Equality Day. So many of the events celebrating suffrage this year have been canceled, and things I had been looking forward to. I'm glad we're getting to celebrate in this way. My research started on women's suffrage in Arizona in the 1990s when I was in graduate school. At the time, the Nita Hill testimony during the Clarence Thomas hearings really brought into focus how few women were in politics and on higher levels in the United States at the time. I knew from what little I was finding that women in Arizona had a pretty strong record of office holding at the state level, county level, and in the legislature. And then shortly after, in 1998, 5 women captured the top 5 executive positions in the state, from governor, secretary of state, superintendent of public education, all the 5 executive officers, one of which was, of course, Janet Napolitano, who was attorney general at the time. Although that women in the 90s were making huge progress in so many ways, I knew that there were so many different obstacles they faced. And then one day, as we were watching, the election news in the background, my daughter, who was maybe 8 or 9 at the time, looked at me and said, "Mom, why don't we have a girl president yet?" And I just didn't even know what to tell the poor thing, because at that time, I don't think there were too many adults that thought that we would see a female president in our lifetime. We hoped there might be, but it really looked pretty grim back then. I knew when I was putting together the book, it's mostly about women after suffrage, but the suffrage movement was the foundation of how women entered into politics, what their first introduction was to the political world that they'd been barred from for so many decades in this country. A lot of the women here, and practically all the suffrage leaders, were white middle-class women who came into the movement because of reform. They were especially interested in the Prohibition movement because alcohol was such a problem in mining towns, and just a huge burden on women in domestic life. There was an added economic dimension in Arizona because this was considered the poorest state, along with New Mexico, when it entered the Union, and that stayed that way until after World War II. Along with poverty, you had some of the highest levels of widowhood, divorce, and abandonment in this state. And that meant a lot of women, regardless of color or class, were left to raise children on their own. Especially a lot of women in this movement in Arizona were middle-class women, often doctors, lawyers, school teachers, clerical workers, and business professionals who had lost a husband or had a disabled husband, and they were raising children on their own. The final political dimension I found that was important to women holding office in this that grew out of the suffrage movement was the intransigence of male politicians in the state. Even those who publicly said, "I am for women's suffrage," when it came down to it, wouldn't vote for the issue in the legislature or vetoed the bill when it came to the governor's desk. And the women who ran the movement were pretty savvy politicians and realized quickly on that male voters were much more open to women and voting. And so as soon as Arizona became a state in 1912, after years of wrangling with the leaders here, they finally kind of gave up and said, okay, we're going to put this on the ballot. And we had the new constitution. It was very progressive, and it allowed petitions to be placed, and women's suffrage passed in 1912 with 68% of the vote, which I believe, I haven't found a public vote anywhere at a higher rate than that. That was quite astounding, not only to leaders here, but the National American Women's Suffrage Association leaders were absolutely bowled over because they hadn't spent much time or money in Arizona. Suffrage leaders, after not growing to distrust state political leaders, said, hey, you know, now that we've won the vote, we want to get all these reform measures passed, yes, but we need to do that on our own. We need to join men in the legislature, in government offices, and start to push our reforms from within, not just lobby from the outside. They had some pretty good leaders who ran for office. Their message was to the women voters, get in the battle yourself. This was in contrast to a lot of other states and the national movement, which after 1920 and the passage of the 19th Amendment 100 years ago today, when the suffrage movement disbanded and was replaced by the League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan organization, most women's clubs at the time refused to get involved in political campaigns. Again, Arizona, I think, coming out of that suffrage battle, had a unique position to promote women candidates and women in politics with a very unusual organization, the Arizona Business and Professional Women's Clubs. Those clubs were all over the country, but ours really went and backed women's campaigns, which most political parties were not doing at the time in the 20s and 30s and 40s. The BPW women raised funds for each other to promote their candidacies. They supported them in election. They turned out and voted for women. And those kinds of things really promoted women. So Rutgers, Center for Women in American Politics, and other political scientists traditionally rank Arizona as one of the top states since statehood, along with Oregon, Washington, Colorado, for electing women to public office. And I think that's why you saw in the 1960s and 70s during the modern women's movement, a lot of women were already in politics, like Sandra Day O'Connor and others who were promoted beyond anyone's belief later on.
Thank you, Heidi. I'm going to open this up to everyone else. Heidi kind of touched on this, so Heidi, if you'd like to extrapolate some, feel free to. But our first question is, what got you interested in researching and writing about suffrage?
You want me to answer first?
Feel free.
Okay. Well, I grew up in the 50s and 60s when you couldn't dream to be about anything higher than a school teacher or a nurse. You could not even imagine becoming president or a governor or anything like that. It was just pretty hard to imagine. And I think I always was curious. You had segregated want ads in the papers back then. The women would only apply for secretarial jobs and teaching jobs. Men got the business and engineering jobs, and they were actually segregated in the newspapers. So for me, I wanted to see early on what kept women, not only in politics, but in business and other avenues, from reaching beyond what was determined to be a proper woman's place. So that was my motivation.
I'll go. Shannon Risk. I'm part of Gen X, so I came of age in the 90s, and one of my university professors was the very famous Glenda Riley. Some of you know Glenda Riley. Yeah, she was fantastic. And in my master's thesis, I kind of seized upon a group of women in Portland, Maine during the Second Great Awakening, who seemed to have a lot of autonomy and used religious missionary work to get that autonomy. And so I kind of dabbled with this idea of how women will try to forge ways into the political atmosphere to, tackle some of the social problems they saw around them. And I think, looking back over the several decades, I think that constructing networks, grassroots networks, is what's most fascinating to me. And then in my other career, I'm a museum professional, and I was hired to be the deputy director at the Susan B. Anthony House in Rochester. And of course, I was completely sold after that. And I've been a suffrage fanatic ever since. Wrote my dissertation on it. But I keep finding new elements to the story, which continue to fascinate me.
Thank you.
For me, it was working on my master's thesis. And I was looking for single women because I was studying a woman who never married. And this was before that very famous book on single women came out. So somebody said, well, why don't you look at the suffragists? Some of them were probably single. Gives you an idea of what people thought. And so I started looking through this book called Citizens at Last, named after a Texas suffragist, and it had several primary sources in it. And I had always learned a very white, middle-class version of suffrage, and I turned the page and there was Christia Adair, a Black suffragist from Texas. And then on the next page was an ad from San Antonio calling on suffragistas to register to vote in 1918 when Texas women got primary suffrage. And that was a very different version of suffrage. I hadn't heard of these other groups in Texas fighting for the right to vote. So that was what first piqued my interest. And then learning that servicemen could not vote in the state of Texas. And so there was this whole fight in World War I where servicemen were disfranchised for the length of their service, and how the suffragists were arguing to lessen those barriers. And at the same time, you didn't have to be a citizen to vote in Texas. So immigrants, including German immigrants in World War I, are voting in the state. So all of these other issues kept coming out of the suffrage movement. I just thought it was much more complicated than the version I had been taught.
This is Kif Augustine-Adams, and I'll just build off of what Rachel points out, because I came to women's suffrage through women's citizenship, and sort of the flip version, and women's citizenship throughout Latin America largely, and particularly from a legal perspective, could you claim citizenship as a woman if you married a foreign man, or were you expatriated? And so the famous case McKinsey versus Hare, where the California woman marries an Englishman and loses her citizenship, and the Supreme Court of the United States says, yeah, well, you consented. You consented implicitly to the loss of your citizenship because you married a foreigner. And so my research and what I wrote for the roundtable is also linked very specifically to underlying questions of citizenship and access to the franchise that way.
Which was one of the original goals of the League of Women Voters, was independent citizenship.
This is Karen Pastorello, and I wanted to mention that I came to suffrage as a labor historian because I'm the same generation as Heidi, and we grew up in the 50s and 60s, and careers and professions and even trade opportunities were very limited for women. So I started to think about suffragists as workers, not just what we would consider working class suffragists, but elite and middle class suffragists as well, because looking at the primary sources, they actually consider themselves workers, even though the elite and middle class women often weren't paid. Some of the working class leaders were in fact paid, many times through donations. And one woman in particular, Mary Elizabeth Pidgeon, who was a young school teacher and came to upstate New York, talks in her diary about how much she was paid. And it was, I think it was $75 a month. And she was expected to pay not only all her expenses, but she had to also pay any speaker she invited in, pay for any suffrage literature, and so on. So by expanding the definition of work and working women, I began to think, as I said, about these suffragists as workers, and it revealed a lot, not only about who was working, but what their work was like on a day-to-day basis. I found very interesting. And it also allowed me to begin to think about not only hundreds of suffrage leaders involved in this, but literally hundreds of thousands of suffrage women who were working for the suffrage cause.
This is Sara Egge, and I study women's suffrage in the Midwest. And I came to it actually as an undergrad. I took my first history course ever in college was a women's history course. And I got done with the course. I thought it was great, but the section on women's suffrage troubled me. And I said, well, where are the rural women? Where are the Midwestern women? And the instructor said, there's really not a whole lot we know about rural women in the women's suffrage movement. And that sparked an interest in me at 19 years old to pursue research. I went to a number of Midwestern schools, and I'll never forget, as I was working on my master's and PhD, my advisor, who was wonderful, sort of said, good luck finding sources. And so I ended up pouring through a bunch of newspapers, church records, federated women's clubs or ladies' aid societies and churches to find these women, because they often didn't talk about their activism in sort of visible ways. And then, as Rachel and Kif were saying, my research landed me in really bigger questions about citizenship, in particular as it relates to immigrants, like Texas, South Dakota, and Minnesota, which are two states I study extensively, both allowed non-citizens to vote. And that became a significant issue. And in South Dakota, the case was so pervasive in 1918 that the amendment was actually rewritten, and a clause to disenfranchise these non-citizen voters was added to the amendment to enfranchise women. And that became one of the kind of hallmarks of my research, was trying to understand how women were making this case about disenfranchising these German, even though it's all immigrants, particularly directed at German immigrants during World War I, wrestling with this idea of voting rights and who ought to vote and how that relates to citizenship. So a lot of overlaps, which is really great.
Thank you, everyone. So the next question is more thinking historically. How would you say that suffrage activism fits into other reform movements of the same time period? So looking at the progressive era, I think that one of the kind of perennial questions is, was the progressive era really progressive? So how would you say that suffrage fits into these other kinds of reform movements?
This is Karen again, and I should mention that I look primarily at New York State suffragists in relation to the national movement. And I definitely think that these suffragists were probably more than progressive, even though many of them had roots in the Midwest, or progressivism as a movement has roots in the Midwest. It comes east very quickly, and by about 1910, 1912, the suffragists are very much involved in fighting for more than just suffrage. You can see a direct shift in the tactics, in that they begin to, this new generation, what we call new women traditionally, those who are tend to be more independent, they tend to be educated, many are self-supporting, and many are professionals as well. They tend to be the ones fighting for social, economic, legal, and political justice. So I think they definitely are part of that bigger progressive movement.
I also see in that, long progressive era, we go from the original pledge of Susan B. Anthony and her cohort to not get involved with partisan politics. We start to see the women choose sides, especially in the state of Maine, which is what I wrote my dissertation about. I was actually looking at cross-border collaborations with New Brunswick, Canada, just to examine democracy and participation in two separate systems. But one of the things I did notice was that early on, the Maine women thought that the Republican Party, which held sway, you think of James G. Blaine, for example, they thought that maybe that was the best route to go, but both the Democrats were painting them as, prohibitionists, temperance workers, etc. But by the time we get to the early 1900s, there is a shift. Some of these women are jumping ship from the Republicans and embracing the Democrats in my state, with the hope, as we move away from Roosevelt and Taft to don't promote women's suffrage, Roosevelt not till later, we start to see them embracing the Democrats. And that's not all suffragists, but we start to see suffragists starting to work within specific political parties, attempt to move their way up beyond women's auxiliary committees and so forth to actually getting in the game themselves. And in 1920, one thing we don't always talk about was that in some states, it also became legal to run for office. And we see that in Rhode Island as well. So we start to see women running for office. Gail Laughlin in Maine, for example. So women are starting to, in that last generation, really move into partisan political work.
This is Kif, I want to bring it back to what Heidi mentions in her book that we're all responding to and interacting with, she talks specifically about the success in Arizona of the vote in some way for women, or at least removing restrictions for some women to vote, in part being an easier slog than in some of the other places, specifically because the racial politics in Arizona were different than, and the immigration context was different than, say, along the East Coast or along the West Coast. And so even as we think about women's enfranchisement and gaining that right, as Sara mentions also, in so many ways, that enfranchisement depends on racialized politics and the exclusion and the loss of other peoples, women of color, men of color, immigrants. And so the work that I do in Mexico looks at that specifically in the state of Sonora, and how the earliest arguments for women's enfranchisement there were so that women could help exclude Chinese people. And so as we think about women's progress, or the progress of particularly white women, I think we need to take into account also the contradictions in that, and the exclusion, and the much less than progressive approach to humanity on which that sometimes depended, both explicitly and implicitly.
Sorry, Kif. I'd like to jump in here. I think that question about exclusion is really important. The story we tend to tell about suffrage is usually very celebratory, and it's of this like national sisterhood. But we know that the story is much more complicated. Could you share something from your research about what you've uncovered about the other part of this story, if you will, including women of color, perhaps lesser known suffragists, or anti-suffrage activists?
I'll go. In Arizona, there was, as Kif was mentioning, this movement that the Arizona women in the suffrage movement aligned with the Labor Party. There were a lot of women who were socialists in the suffrage movement. I was going to say that was one of the things. It was quite a diverse background of women. And labor organizers were very busy trying to ostracize Mexican American voters with literacy tests. And that happened in 1909 in the legislature, and it was solidified later on after statehood as well. And women in the suffrage movement saw that the Labor Party was ascendant, and that was really, they were grabbing a lot of the voters, so they hitched their wagon to that rising star, and they backed that legislation that would limit people who could vote to those who could read and write English in a sufficient way, and that was a very arbitrary way. And it was believed to maybe limit 20 to 30% of the Mexican population, especially down in Tucson in the southern part of the state. And so I think they started out, but that policy was brought here by Laura Clay of Kentucky, because she was kind of an architect in the South of ostracizing African-American women in the suffrage movement, because they believed that would scare away white male voters. So she came here and, as Kay Betten-Cohen has said, instituted this policy that was Jim Crow Southwestern style. So that's what happened in Arizona. And at the same time, local leaders realized they wanted to reach out to people who spoke Spanish and publish pamphlets in Spanish. So it was this very mixed bag. They obviously didn't handle it very well or consistently one way or the other, but that's what happened here.
As far as immigrant working women went in the Northeast, especially in the cities of New York and Rochester, Buffalo, Troy is another working class city in New York State. Anti-suffragists tended to use immigrant working class women in some ways as part of their argument. They would tell them that the world of politics was too grueling and too corrupt for them to enter. They would also use the argument that women, if allowed to participate in any way in politics, whether it be elected to office or just, by exercising the right to vote, they're really given right to vote, even though they wouldn't admit that, that they would neglect their families. So the anti-suffragists actually used that rhetoric to argue against suffrage, which was rather interesting. And when we're talking about immigrants, of course, we're talking primarily about Southern and Eastern European immigrants from Poland, Italy, Lithuania, Russia, that part of the world. So,
oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add on to that. In Maine, Rhode Island, places where a big Francophone population came down from Quebec, at the same time that farms were not, functioning as well in Quebec, you have this kind of long trail of Canadian immigrants, Franco-Canadian immigrants to the East Coast, especially to the clothing, shoe factories, textile mills, that sort of thing. And especially in Maine, the Francophone population tries to rebuff any what looks like Protestant incursion into the sanctity of the Quebecois, the Francophone family. And so you see a lot of priests speaking out against suffrage. This is just one more way. They're trying to force our kids to go to public school. They're trying to incorporate Protestant ethics into the public school system. And suffrage falls along those lines as well. And not all Francophone women agree with this. There are editorials in some of the, the Lewiston Auburn newspaper, Lewiston Auburn, dual cities in Maine, where there was a high Franco population. But when we think of immigrant, it's wherever you are, it's kind of the Anglo suffragists against the other. It might sometimes even be the Irish in Providence, but of course there were certainly prominent Irish suffragists as well. And in terms of African-American suffragists, and Karen wrote the book on New York State, but we see them really being pushed aside by the 1890s. Of course, they form their own very powerful civil rights groups. I don't think we could see a modern civil rights movement without those networks of African-American women in the early progressive era.
And that's another really interesting piece about Heidi's book, is how there's separate clubs and separate organizations for white women and for African American women who they organize separately and create, well, they organize separately because the white women are excluding people. It's not, you know, it's clearly a segregationist effort. And so then the connections and the opportunities that develop in those clubs and organizations are strikingly different in terms of the training grounds for women to actually run for political office. And I thought it was really interesting to compare the Anglo white women's organizations, the African American women's organizations, and then the Mexican American or Mexican origin women's organizations as well, and how they differed in their structures. And some of the Mexican American women, Mexican origin women's organizations are subunits of men's organizations. They're underneath that organization as opposed to independent organizations. And just, it's a really different structure that makes it harder to uncover that kind of history.
Right, and I was gonna say, in Arizona, we're finding out more and more that there were women with, you know, it's always hard to you have to dig real deep, but Hispanic surnames that were belonging to some of these women's clubs in these early days that were kind of overlooked because they didn't rise above to leadership till maybe a decade or so later. But there wasn't a complete ban on women. In fact, the Arizona Federation of Women's Clubs ended the ban on non-Black women joining. So other races could join, but still not Black women in 1919. And Arizona BPW clubs allowed everybody to join. You see Asian women, you see quite a diverse group, and we're trying to put together those stories of what was happening in the 1910s and the 1920s, because we don't really have a clear picture of it all yet.
When Black women in Texas went to register to vote and were turned away in 1918, they sued to be allowed to register, even though they wouldn't be able to vote in the white primary. And when the Texas Equal Suffrage Association president heard about this, she assumed they had been organized by anti-suffragists to try to get the law thrown out. Because they knew in a southern state, if women's suffrage was associated with Black voting, it would fall. And so in many ways, the all-white primary provided this kind of safe test, which was primary suffrage, which you see in Texas and Arkansas. And this is basically a test. Will the Jim Crow laws in place keep Black women from voting the way they've kept Black men from voting? And white Southerners are very clear that they are concerned that the level of violence they use against Black men to keep from the polls, they couldn't use against Black women at that same level without backlash. And so there was a great fear about Black women being enfranchised, and primary suffrage kind of tested that. And so much so that in 1921, just after the 19th Amendment, Texas decided the white primary wasn't safe enough, wasn't strong enough, and they legislated it for the first time. It had only been up to the Democratic Party to run the all-white primary until 1921, but the threat of Black women voting, even the few who managed it in 1920, was enough for the state to act to try to shore up the all-white primary. Luckily, they overstepped their bounds and created the very issue that would bring it down in Smith v. Allwright.
One of the things in the Midwest that we see in terms of something that Heidi does a really nice job talking about is that a lot of the women saw politics as a business, or at least as an extension of their civic engagement and their community engagement. And so for a lot of them, they were politically savvy, and they approached it from a lot of the same mechanisms that a lot of the other panelists have talked about: federated women's clubs, or ladies' aid societies and churches, or some sort of collective network, basically. And so these were primarily Anglos in my work. They're known as Yankees within that particular context. So a lot of these people had fought for the North in the Civil War, and then either were from that Midwestern area, or they moved into the Midwest. And so they really see themselves as promoting this civic engagement spirit. And they also then see these immigrants who refuse to assimilate. This is a rural area with very little infrastructure, and they can largely stay within their isolated ethnic enclaves. And they see them taking their their children to parochial schools and continuing to speak in their native languages. And they find that really offensive over time. And especially as World War I approaches, they think that that's a real question of their actual American loyalty. So there's this savviness, and it then begins to be connected to progressivism, which I know is another question that we're tackling. For many of the Midwestern women who came to suffrage, they came through the Temperance Union, Women's Christian Temperance Union. In a number of the states that I study, the Temperance Union was also the suffrage association, which made it very difficult because a lot of the immigrants also had ethnic cultures steeped in alcohol consumption. And so you get this problem for these Yankee or Anglo women that they see these immigrants who are what they think refusing to assimilate and pushing against these American values. And then what starts to happen is they don't just say, oh, they just drink all the time. They start to say they're not sober, they're not upright, they don't understand democracy. So the very question of their behavior becomes an indication that they are unfit. And you can think about all of the rhetoric at this time, and especially by the early 20th century, about fitness and who is fit to become a citizen. That's very much steeped into the Midwest at this point. But I also want to add another group to this, because it's not just immigrants. We also can see the same language applied to immigrants in the Midwest that was applied to African American men in the South, being ignorant and uneducated, and they're illiterate. Those kinds of words were used in these regions. And I think that's really an important note when we think about the power of white supremacy to define these progressive women or the people who are engaged here. But it's also applied as well to, in the Midwest, the indigenous communities that in some cases did have access to becoming citizens. It was not widespread. Largely Native Americans or indigenous communities won't have the opportunity to become citizens until after the 19th Amendment is passed in 1924. But nevertheless, there are some opportunities for some indigenous communities to do so. But those same words are applied to these, in particular in South Dakota. I'm thinking of the Lakota or the Dakota, where they're called uneducated and worse by both state and national leaders. And so I think there's this, again, when we think about who can vote and who has the characteristics, it's not even just necessarily citizenship. Over time in the Midwest, it becomes about your racial background and how you can be further racialized to either include you or exclude you. But it also becomes this question about behavior. And do you have and do you demonstrate American values or not? And then the height of this is, of course, World War I, where patriotic demonstrations are paramount to even keep you out of jail. So I think there's a lot. I love the threads that I'm seeing here. We think about how these women are navigating this particular time. They want the right to vote. In some cases, they're desperate. They're advocating over decades to engage in politics. They've already been doing it. They just need this vote. But it becomes a matter of both sort of responding to and then articulating new ways of seeing themselves in an increasingly fraught, sometimes, context.
And it leads to some really interesting strategies. In Texas, at least, they don't want to talk about Black people because they know that suffrage, if it's tied up with Black suffrage, is just not going to work. But then it becomes about disfranchising immigrants. And you would think, and Carrie Chapman Catt points out the German immigrants in Texas, because the two largest immigrants in the state were German and Mexican. And yet the state suffragists go after the Mexican immigrants. It's easier to go after the racialized immigrant instead of the so-called alien enemy during the war.
Yeah, building on this, I know in Arizona, building on what you said, Sarah, you know, Arizona came in 1912 and had been kept from statehood, New Mexico as well, for decades, because for the very reasons you laid out, the citizens here were considered too uneducated, too illiterate, spent too much time, they didn't speak English, they spent too much time in saloons and brothels. And so women who were in the suffrage movement felt they had to combat that image. to get, not only to justify them getting the vote, but for them being able to gain statehood. And this came from Congress, from Alfred Beveridge and the Committee on Territories, and from the president on down. Teddy Roosevelt just was adamantly against letting these alien type people into the Union. And so that really just builds up that toxicity in the meeting, in the movements.
So a related but perhaps more philosophical question, thinking about the ways in which we envision the past. I'm sure everyone who's read a history monograph has noticed that there's a chapter that's the women's chapter, or the non-white people chapter, and it's kind of segregated from the rest of the text. So how do we get away from this idea that these moments in history are siloed? How do we get away from these chapters, if you will, about the women's sphere or about race relations?
Well, I think we have to get away from a very androcentric way of telling history, for starters, where men are at the center. And if men are at the center and male experiences are seen as normal, then they disappear, right? Because the normal doesn't get commented on. But certainly when we talk about most aspects of this nation's history, or multinational history, if you will, women and men are both active in every sector, honestly. Take your World War I history, where there's a chapter on nurses, but nurses and soldiers did not exist separately from each other. I think we can integrate the history, but we have to move away from white male centered, elite white male centered. Certainly lots of white male immigrants who are in that other class, right? But we have to look at history as a collaboration. And if we approach history as a collaboration, we actually begin to tell a truer history. I don't know that we can ever arrive at any absolutely known facts in some of these interpretations, but we arrive at a history where people are interacting with each other. Men and women, despite the separate spheres ideology, are violating that all the time in the progressive era, right? The separate sphere ideology is often preached about, and the politicians wag their fingers at the women coming to the Capitol to present petitions or to meet with their male legislators. But in the world of business, in the farming community, Sarah, I grew up in Northeast Iowa, in a rural farming town. Yes, there are different expectations. There's a double standard, but men and women are interacting in every single aspect of the history that we tell. We just don't tell it that way.
I think one way we get at this is by interrogating our definitions a little bit. So if we just want to talk about politics, too often people think of white male political office holders, and yet you've heard several of the speakers tonight refer to the suffragists as being political and being politically savvy. That's part of politics. And so if we kind of expand our definitions a little bit, we get a fuller picture. If your definition of suffragist is someone who is in an equal suffrage association, then yeah, you're going to get a lot of white middle class women. But if suffragist means anyone who fought or expressed desire for women to have the right to vote, all of a sudden suffragists start looking very different.
Yeah, and expanding on what you said, Rachel, you took the words right out of my mouth, expanding definitions and broadening our horizons, like you were saying, Shannon. I was lucky enough to study under Kitty Sklar, who did so much work on women's culture in Chicago, and the importance of the settlement movement, and how we tend to look at politics, as you were saying, as a formal endeavor, when in fact women, even well before they had the right to vote, were very political. So what it meant to be political, say in the 1880s or 1890s for a woman, versus what it means to be politically formal now, are two different things. And we have to recognize that and see it through the lens that they looked at it during their lifetimes.
I have an image from Heidi's book that goes through my head of women on horseback or women in cars driving miles and miles and miles for days across the rural landscape of Arizona among the red rock and among the cactus, and that that image sticks in my head as an example of why Arizona is perhaps a little bit different than many of the other states, because women were already doing all sorts of things that did not fit the really rigid private public sphere separation. And so, you know, Arizona can be a leader in some ways because life was so hard and so spread out, and self-reliance and doing it yourself were really talents that served women well in managing ranches and families and farms, and then they could translate that into some of the more explicitly political endeavors as well.
You know, an example of that is, you know, most of these women, like I said, in the suffrage movement and women's clubs, they worked outside the home, and because they had to. Frances Willard Munns did after she was married, and then her husband's cattle business picked up and she could spend some time, but she was mostly taking care of her growing children and her aging mother. But she was asked in 1919 to go to Connecticut to work on the 19th Amendment and to convert Connecticut women. Well, you can imagine this, you know, crazy Western woman. She was dubbed the Nevada Wildcat because she grew up in Nevada when she was in boarding school. And when she went to Connecticut, she goes, "These people are stuffed shirts. I can't believe how rigid they are. Nobody laughs and everyone's so serious." She really, I think it sunk into her why it was taking so long for women to win rights in the East. Women had these special roles. They had servants, which she never had. You know, it was just a different world. And she and other women like her that went into the legislature, they were some of the first ones, not her, but people that followed her, that women that learned to fly, because they were coming from Parker, Arizona, the state capital, to serve in the legislature. And that's a tough drive today, let alone back then when you're in a Model T going over unpaved roads that wash out. So these women were adventurous because they had to be. And that was it. And they learned that, okay, you fall, you get back up and you do it again. I mean, I think there are other Western states where similar things happen. We just don't always see about it because we don't have enough state studies of some of these areas. And that's where you need depth. And that's what I was going to say. How do you incorporate women better? You got to have in-depth studies of women like these panelists are doing and many others are doing. I think there's one other thing to overcome, and it's male historians. I have them tell me all the time, they are terrified of dealing with women's history. They think they're going to get chastised and yelled at. And maybe we need to figure out a way to reach out to them and say, hey, you know what? Ask for help. Oh, maybe they can't do that. I don't know, but ask for help. We'll work together on putting together state history, economic history, things like that. I know you think of Tombstone as being this rough and tough Wild West town. There were hundreds of women who ran businesses there. And no, they were not all brothel owners or saloon owners. They ran respectable businesses, boarding houses, millinery shops, you name it. And do you ever see that? There's whole books dedicated to the economic life of Tombstone. They're never even mentioned, but they were there and they were the city founding mothers as well, alongside as the city founding fathers. So we need to sort of figure out how to work together to get their stories all told.
Heidi, I'm so glad that you brought up state history. That's one of the things that I hear a lot as a state historian, is this idea that state level history is parochial. How would you respond to that? And do you think that state to state level comparisons are fruitful in kind of furthering conversations about these untold historical narratives?
I think that's sometimes the only way to figure out what's working and what's not working for women and men. When I started out on this project, Linda Van Ingen was doing work on women in California politics, and we sat down and compared notes and realized how different the structures were that they were inhabiting. And when we flesh that out, it just crystallizes your thinking about things. So I think it's absolutely essential. I dare you to go look and not find a state history for all 50 states of what men were in the legislature or what men were doing to found that state. So why can't we have women's stories about that and find a way to integrate them?
I find it fascinating when people call the lived experiences of other people parochial, and it's on that individual level that experience happened. These are people's lives that we're talking about, their families, their interaction with the world, how they survive. And what I loved also about Heidi's book is the individual stories, the individual actors, and the pieces of how they come together as individuals to effectuate the change. But if history, I mean, non-parochial history is, the 1,000 view up here and the government level and just all structure as opposed to the lived experience of people, we miss out on so much richness, and we miss out on so much depth that informs where we are now and can help us understand so much more about people's lives.
We need to move beyond the superstar, historical agent or actor. It tells us not that much about what's going on the ground. And again, I'm a fan of reconstructing networks. I want to see how real people affected change. And it also, the message that, most change actually happens in these local, state, regional networks, that's empowering to us today, that we are not helpless and that we can affect change by joining together, right? By collective action in that way, in the ways that some of these unique suffrage movements in different states and different regions were able to seize upon. Susan B. Anthony, a very dynamic figure. But what does that tell us about everyday men and women in New York State or some of the other places? She traveled everywhere. We know there's even a plaque dedicated to her in the Alps. But that doesn't tell us much about the everyday lived experience, as Kif is saying. So parochial is such an interesting term to me, and I agree with you. It is there to eliminate the very legitimate experiences of people who are, outside of that sense of famous historical figures, and even female firsts don't tell us very much. It's the easy way out when we say things like that, when we ignore that movements are diverse and messy and personal. It's an oversimplification of history, and it's not very interesting to me either.
I think it'd be really tough to understand the suffrage movement if you only wanted to look at it at the national level, because the states are so important to that fight. And in part because of the way the Constitution sets up voting rights. Voting is not guaranteed to the citizens of the United States. It's left to the states. That is a state fight. And it looks a little different in every state, and yet there's always comparisons and crossover. Texas is the only state that completely disfranchises its servicemen, but a lot of other states just didn't send absentee ballots, or did like Oklahoma. They had the silent vote clause. So if you had an amendment, you had to have enough yes votes to outweigh the no and the people who didn't vote on the amendment but still voted. And so what they would do for their suffrage amendment, which their politicians didn't want to pass, is they sent ballots to those soldiers who were on training camps within the state and just left off the amendment. So they effectively voted no on their behalf. So we see these kind of things that you might say, well, this is only for our state, but there's always some other overlap somewhere else that maybe you wouldn't have gotten to if you hadn't started on the state level.
I would argue that you even be more microcosmic or more parochial, as we don't like to say, and start with the local history societies and organizations. We found, and I co-wrote, Shannon, thank you for mentioning the book, but I also co-wrote with Susan Goodyear. And together we found that New York State, at the time suffrage was finally passed in 1917, had over 450 local political equality clubs that we know of, and probably many more that we don't know. And to talk with the historians in these towns and villages and cities, we have learned so much, and of course we couldn't do it all, and that's part of what we hope to do, is kind of motivate others to do the work that, you know, we haven't finished yet. It's always a work in progress. But we learned so much about the state and national movement from what went on at the local level. So I would strongly suggest anybody working in the area not necessarily start with their local historians, but at least somehow connect and collaborate with them at some point in your research.
I was going to mention the American Online Suffrage Biography Project, which is live. And for those of you who are listening tonight, watching and listening, you can get in there and learn about some of these subalterns, right? These parochials that, you know, these state, local, even town-based suffragists, and you know, what they were up to. And it's such a diverse experience.
I also think as we hit, you know, the centennial, everyone likes to tell the Harry Burns story over and over again of like the one vote that made it possible. But when you look at all these other states, you realize this was really contingent. Like that story happens in some version in a lot of states that, you know, they almost lost, but for this one vote, or they did lose because of this one vote. And so I think it's a nice reminder, if we kind of get into more of those stories, that this was not guaranteed to happen in 1920. This was a really tough fight.
So I have one final prepared question, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Laura Key for questions from the chat. It's 2020, as if we could forget by this point. And while women are no less politically active, they still do not have equal access to political power. Why do you think that is? And can you give an example from your own research in which women's voices or votes had a significant impact on a political issue?
I know that, you know, political scientists, not historians, deal in these statistics, but yeah, there's a lot of science in that the political parties consistently over the years haven't given funding to women as readily as to men. Large donors have failed to fund women's candidates. And still, the numbers are between 70 and 74% of voters can imagine or be comfortable with a woman as a president at the highest office. I know in Arizona, some of the women that served early on, like Frances Willard Munns, who was elected to the state senate in 1914, tried to elevate to Secretary of State, and was told that she couldn't do that. She tried to run and lost in the primary, but the campaign material used against her, you couldn't trust a woman to be first in line for the governor's office, because that's what the Secretary of State was. Anya Frohmiller won the Democratic primary here in 1950 to the surprise of the Democratic Party. They were unprepared and they did not support her candidacy, even though this was an overwhelmingly Democratic state at that time. They didn't give her volunteers or funding, and still she almost beat her Republican candidate. It was a very close election. I think those women would understand what Janet Napolitano tells everybody when she first ran for Attorney General in Arizona. The press asked her, "Are you running as a woman candidate?" And she was sure that her opponent was not asked the same question. So from the media to funding to political parties. Historically speaking, women have not been on an equal footing. Are they getting there? Absolutely. But I think there's still some very strong residual biases within the electorate and the political party system.
I think our images of power are still very masculine, and we judge powerful women by a different standard. There's almost a running joke online that I'll vote for women, but not that woman. And then the next time another one runs, but not that woman. Right? They're okay voting for a theoretical woman, just not an embodied one. And so I think we have a lot of issues with kind of overcoming those types of biases. I will say for Texas, a lot of the suffragist and a lot of the other women's clubs movements that kind of came together after suffrage formed what they called the Joint Legislative Council. The men called them the Petticoat Lobby. But they were a force to be reckoned with. They had the age of consent raised in Texas. They did prison reform. They did funding for maternal and infant care. So many different progressive reforms were put through successfully in a southern state, largely by groups of suffragists and other progressive leaders who continued that work into the 20s and 30s, one of whom went on to become the first Secretary of State in Texas.
When I attended a conference to celebrate the centennial of New York State suffrage the conference was in 2017. We had some speakers that were part of the New York State legislature, part of the Women's Caucus. So they have their own Women's Caucus to try to empower them. And they made a very important point. More than one person spoke about this. The fact that when women run for office, they're usually, for a lot of the reasons Heidi said, funding in particular, they're usually defeated the first time and then they quit. But men, they're defeated once, keep going. And I thought that was a really keen observation.
I don't know. I mean, in modern times, women are still juggling more of the caring duties, caring for elders, caring for the young, and that's got to change. In my own studies in the state of Maine, I'll go back to this point that women, they learn how to be lobbyists, as all of you have been saying. The example of the Texas women, they learn how to be very powerful lobbyists, and they actually formulate new tactics that other lobbyists will adopt, right? But the pressure politics that they are able to learn. And then, in the two states that I've studied more extensively, Rhode Island and Maine, women are ready to run for office the minute it is legal to do so. They are prepared. And yes, they might not win the first election, they might. A more modern political study, and I'm skirting my brain at the moment, showed that women tend to run for office that is closer to home in modern times, which goes back to the whole caring aspect and, where women's perceived responsibilities lie, or very real responsibilities lie, in a society where men are still not sharing their full load when it comes to household functions and so on.
And yet, if you poll them, men will say that things are far more equal in their household than their wives will say.
Right. We're still quietly doing the laundry, right?
Yeah.
One of the, I just wanted to shout out to the chat group. There was a question about lesbian women in the suffrage movement, and I gave several works there because one of the women, I'm writing a biography on a woman who was in a female partnership. I don't know whether it was romantic or not. It could have been friendship, it could have been economic, but they seemed pretty devoted to each other. We'll put it that way. And so I've done some study on this, specifically for that reason. But just as an aside, if you're interested in that topic, go through the chat, scroll through the chat. I put some books down there for you. Extra reading.
All right, everyone. Oh, well, Sarah, I'll let you go and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Key to cover the rest of the chat questions.
Okay, I'll just be brief and say in my research, since I look at a lot of rural women, as Shannon was saying, that women, there's certainly double standard, but they are on the ground working in the fields as in some ways they're partners. Even in the state of Iowa today, of the land in Iowa, over half of it's owned by women. So to me, in particular, if I think of the rural context, there's a lot of power that women have. I think in some ways it's the expression of power, or as Rachel said, there's this image that we cling to. And I think that shapes so much of what we expect. And I'll say we expect of ourselves, that what we say about ourselves and about other women, and then what men assume too. So it's that the pervasive notions of gender that are shaping how we formulate our political identities. And it remains, even though practically we know that these things are happening, that women are running for office and succeeding and doing all this excellent work. And so I think there is a lot to do to match what we're actually seeing on the ground, especially the importance of the local elections. Women are winning seats in lots of local elections, and they did even 100 years ago. And so how can we make that, how can we actually articulate that and make that part of the way we think about who is political and how they express those politics?
Great, thank you so much. And again, I'm Laura Key, and I have been kind of compiling some questions from the chat, and I love getting these questions, and it's really spurred on the conversation. So I'm just going to read a couple for as much time as that we have, and kind of going in chronological from the beginning to recent. One of them was, besides voting, I'm hearing a lot of things that were other, quote, rights of men that women had to gain, like citizenship, transfer, property, applying to jobs. Did any have as much opposition in their times as voting? Are there any rights that are still unequal in the law that you think we need to work on? Kind of two-part question, I guess, and it's open to anybody.
I think the one that took a lot longer in most states than winning the right to vote was the right to serve on juries. It didn't happen in most states till much, much later, because women were thought to be too fragile to sit in a jury. And then, of course, they felt like you couldn't have a jury of your peers unless you could sit on a jury as a woman. So that was one that was a long time coming, that I think was fought over more quietly than the right to vote.
I think that the articulation of the question as one of rights is really interesting. And are we thinking about things as a bundle of rights that men have that women want to have? Because what I would suggest is that there are a whole bunch of privileges that men have, and I want to call them privileges as opposed to rights, that
freedoms, would we call them freedoms? Freedoms,
well, and just basic pieces of being human that women don't have today. And I don't know that I would necessarily call them rights, but equal pay for equal work, the gender wage gap, the racial gender wage gap is particularly extreme. The assumption that you are a competent human being rather than having to prove that competence over and over and over. When I go to the immigration detention centers in Arizona and not in Arizona, in Texas, although I have been to Arizona too, and take my law students, for many of the white men, is the first time that they walk into a situation where people don't automatically assume their competence. And they are the people who are, and we go to family detention centers where the women and children are jailed, and they are the scary people. And it's the women who, in the group, who are presumed competent and can connect more easily. And that, for many of the men, is a really shocking encounter, which I was like, well, you have to actually do something in that context to earn trust and respect and competence. We're not just all going to presume that the white guy approach is the way to go. And so I'm resisting a little bit this concept of rights, because what I would hope is that we don't have a bundle of rights as such, but that we can recognize everybody as human and but now Hannah Arendt's going through my head, and citizenship and the right to have rights, and so I'm going to stop.
I'm thinking of the ways then and now that society views Black and brown women, Black and brown girl children, the lack of protection, how long it took us to get age of consent laws in the progressive era, so that we were not marrying off 12-year-old girls. But I translate that thinking that has been with us since genocide and slavery, of how we treat Black and brown women and Black and brown girls. And one of the biggest crises that we focus on when I teach Canadian history, but it should be US history, Mexican history as well, is the disappeared, right? This idea that certain women are somehow disposable, which is an atrocity, but these attitudes are not new, and they are steeped in the foundation of this country. And so, you know, in the suffrage era, we might hear about white slavery, which is always a fun one, right? This fear of white maidens being carted off, as a kind of projection, when in fact the opposite was happening then, it's happening now. And, you know, some Anglo women recognize this, working on the plains, of course, but this is part of rights. This is part of identity. This is part of the freedom to be who you are. And you know, if we're spinning suffrage out into all of these other things, just the sanctity of one's own worth and bodily worth and so on.
Great, thank you. Anybody else before I move on to a different question?
I was just going to add, we talked a little bit about married women's independent citizenship, being able to retain your birthright citizenship as an American woman if you married someone who wasn't a US citizen. And that the League of Women Voters and suffragists went on to fight for that. They considered it important to the suffrage fight. And in 1928, you get the Cable Act that fixes some of that, but it's super racialized. So you could keep your citizenship if you married someone racially eligible for citizenship at that point. But if you were marrying someone who was racially ineligible, you still lost your citizenship. That was a decades more long fight to kind of change the citizenship laws in ways that weren't so overtly racist.
And also in that same context, the right to pass of women to pass their citizenship on to their children, which was not the historic rule, except in a negative sense for enslaved women, who the child inherited the enslaved mother's status, born into enslaved status, as opposed to that of the father, and assuming the father was not enslaved. In all other contexts in that colonial period and way far forward in the United States, men passed their citizenship on to their children in ways that women did not. The positive part of their citizenship.
Well, then my next question kind of goes in with that. It really wasn't a question. There were a couple of comments, but how does like racism and that exclusion of the suffrage and suffrage movement, how does that play out in how we teach it and how we understand the suffrage movement and how we understand how region is so important to understanding suffrage and women's movements overall kind of discussion?
I think we're seeing a lot of this at the centennial of suffrage historians fighting that language of saying that the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, instead of saying that it, you know, removed one barrier, right? So you couldn't keep people from voting because they were women now, but there's so many women who don't get the right to vote in 1920. And so our language has changed a little bit to be more accurate, which I think is really good.
Right.
But I also think we have to take into consideration the larger set of voting laws. And again, that's mostly at the state level, because that's where we really see efforts to restrict suffrage to white men and women.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Sarah. Go ahead.
I'll just add that when I teach women's suffrage, I don't teach it as a just sort of the women's suffrage movement, but it's really voting. And then you can get at a lot of these exclusionary practices, and you can think about race, you can think about immigration and citizenship status. You can think about even ideas of jurisdiction, and as the United States sort of imperialistic endeavors, how did it classify people? How did it classify territories and different places, and also use racialized language at the same time? And then those suffragists will also then talk about even people domestically using that language as well, even though there's these international contexts. So to me, I think when I think about voting and who can vote and how do we determine that, women's suffrage is part of that, but I think starting and ending with the National American Women's Suffrage Association is a real disservice. And I agree that I think there are new words that we're using and new narratives we're telling, and we're still working on it. We're still finding these voices and making a point to say the narrative is not that is not our narrative of women's suffrage, that sort of white middle class elite woman. That's not the narrative.
Right.
And partially because of that, it doesn't stop in 1920.
Mm-hmm.
And even when we use white elite women, we can study them on different levels. And I think Susan B. Anthony is a prime example, because one of the questions we ask is, was Susan B. Anthony, or maybe even was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, racist? Susan B. Anthony has kind of an interesting background if we look at her really deeply, in that she has lots of African American friends and colleagues surrounding her, but and we know of her friendship with Frederick Douglass, and it's been commemorated lots of different ways. And she's also works very closely with Hester Jeffrey, another African American woman, very closely tied to the churches in Rochester. And Hester Jeffrey is so well thought of by Susan B. Anthony that she actually gives her eulogy when Susan dies in 1906. But yet, if we look at her papers, there's no mention of Hester Jeffrey. So it's kind of interesting, if we look at, when we're arguing to look at state and especially local level history, that's where some of this plays out in more detail.
And I would add to Karen, with Susan B. Anthony, that stuff is found in the letters that survive. A lot of
Not the ones she burned.
Yeah, exactly. Where her sister Mary wept in the backyard for a month, burning all. Once the history of women's suffrage was done, and the biography of Susan B. Anthony, poor Mary Anthony had to burn all the papers. And the suffragist I'm writing about did the same thing. She called it committing it to the flame. But obviously letters do survive. But you're not going to see these, as Karen is saying, in the more, these women wrote their own history, and they left a whole lot out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But they recognized that they were historical agents, which is compelling in itself. We've all seen Lisa Tetralt's book on the myth of Seneca Falls, right? Where suffrage doesn't start at Seneca Falls, and we could say it doesn't end at the 19th Amendment.
Fantastic. God, I could do this all night. So I'm going to do one last question, because I could, as historians, we could just talk forever, right? I'm going to ask one, and I know, it's kind of iffy when you ask historians to talk about current events and history and everything. But one of the questions that came in that I thought was thought-provoking was, women fought so hard to get the vote back in 1920, but so many women choose not to vote today. Is there any explanation to that?
I think there's been some very interesting work done on the efforts to disfranchise people, particularly in the 19th century, 20th century. Sorry, see, it is getting late. I can't even keep my century straight. But there's been a lot of work on how these disfranchising efforts, even when we overturn them, still have historical hangovers for us, and that voting participation has never gone back to what it was before those kind of Jim Crow laws came through the South, and if you want to call it Juan Crow or Jaime Crow, I've heard lots of different versions of this for the Southwest as well. We've never seen that voter participation level go up quite to what it was before those efforts. So not only do we deal with modern efforts at disfranchisement, but we still have historical hangups left over from previous efforts at disfranchisement.
If I'm not mistaken, aren't women the majority of voters today? They outnumber men, don't they? Isn't that what all the studies show?
That's what I've seen. And that it's been a trend for a while.
Yeah. Historically, women were slow to register because they were ostracized from the process, regardless of race. But slowly but surely, different groups, civil rights groups, social justice groups have motivated women, and now they are the majority of voters. So parties are supposedly supposed to court them. I don't know that they do that, but
I mean,
And
we still have
underestimate-
long lines and broken voting booths in minority
Right.
districts.
Mhm.
There's all sorts of chicanery going on, you know.
I appreciate Rachel putting individual choices in a structural context, because yes, it is an individual choice to vote. You actually have to get yourself to the mailbox or the drop-off spot. You have to fill out the ballot yourself. But there are so many structural impediments and limitations and socialization about what you should and shouldn't do, or whether or not what you do can be effective. So I think we need, when we think about women voting or suffrage at all, we need to think about both the structural context in which individual choices for voting actually happen. And just because you remove the restriction on gender for women to vote doesn't mean that it is then an easy thing for women to do.
Especially
anybody to do.
just after the 19th Amendment, many of the states still had poll taxes. How many women actually had control of their household finances and could pay their own poll tax if their husband didn't want that to happen?
There was also property voting in Rhode Island till 1928. It was mostly directed at the Irish because the Irish and the Democrats were ascending, and the Republican stronghold was trying to, you know, push them back as much as they could. But even men were affected by the property holder franchise, right? So that doesn't change sometimes. I haven't studied other states, but this, you know, we like to say that, you know, our voting wasn't tied to property ownership so much, but it was. And I would just also add that a lot of the suffragists, the business women we've been talking about, paid taxes, and that galled them. That they could not vote. Mary Anthony paid the taxes on the Anthony residence where Susan B. Anthony hung her hat when she wasn't on the road. And Mary, like so many others, wrote that note every time she paid her taxes. I'm paying these under duress, right? Taxation without representation is still tyranny. Throwing the founders' words back at them, right?
That's great.
Well, sadly, our evening has come to a close. So I would like to thank all of our amazing panelists for being with us today. This was such an excellent conversation, very stimulating, and I hope that we've all taken something away from it. Now, I wanted to let everyone in the audience know that if you haven't read the roundtable discussion before this panel tonight, you can access the most recent issue of the Journal of Arizona History, I believe for free on Project Muse until the end of this month or next month, Laura?
I think it's next month.
Okay, so until the end of September. So keep an eye out for that. And if you'd like hardcover copies of the Journal of Arizona History, consider becoming a member. And this is usually the part where I tell everyone to get home safe. But I think we're all home safe already. So
we start every conversation. So it's a little bit.
So
maybe those of us on the East Coast are going to bed.
Right.
Okay.
Take care, everyone, and we hope to see you at another AHS presentation.